Bon is a very individual person. He's a lunatic, but he's great.
People think they know Bon Scott, the wild smile, the bottle in one hand, the voice that sounded like gravel catching fire. But the truth is, no one really knew him, not even the fans who swore they did. Because behind the chaos, behind the jokes and the danger and the swagger, Bon carried a side of himself that almost never reached the light, a side he buried on purpose. He played the role of the unbreakable frontman so well that everyone forgot to look behind the mask. Everyone except one person, Angus Young. Years later, Angus would reveal a detail about Bon that didn't just surprise people. It rewrote the entire way fans looked at him. And once you hear it, you'll never see Bon Scott the same way again. But to understand why this revelation matters, you have to go back to where Bon came from, because nothing about his beginning matched the legend he became. Before Bon Scott ever stepped onto a stage, he was just a kid trying to outrun the world. Born in Scotland, raised under gray skies and stricter rules than most adults could handle today, Bon grew up learning two things fast: how to fight back and how to hide the hurt. When his family moved to Australia, the change didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like being dropped into a place where he didn't fit. Not in the accent, not in the attitude, not in the expectations. Teachers labeled him disruptive. Authority figures saw a problem child instead of a kid who simply couldn't sit still while his head buzzed full of music. He was punished so often, he once joked that he spent more time outside classrooms than inside them. But anyone who paid attention noticed something else brewing under that mischief, a restlessness that felt too big for the life he was living. As a teenager, Bon drifted toward music the same way a storm finds open sky. Drums, bagpipes, vocals. He tried everything, not because he was lost, but because he was searching for the one thing that made him feel alive. Still, even then, nothing came easy. When he auditioned for a local band, the members took one look at his wild energy, his sharp tongue, and said he wasn't band material. That should have crushed him, but Bon was wired differently. Rejection hit him like fuel. He started practicing with the intensity of someone preparing for war. He pushed his voice until it crackled, twisted, and finally developed that dangerous rasp that would later hypnotize stadiums. Old recordings from his early groups show flashes of that signature sound.
Made me feel so good. I'd like to hold you if I only could.
Not polished, not perfect, but raw and edged with something electric. Friends said Bon couldn't stand being ordinary. If he felt pain, he amplified it into fire. If he felt misunderstood, he turned it into music that could shatter a room. People always describe Bon Scott as reckless, like he stumbled into greatness by accident. But the truth? Behind every scream was calculation. Behind every wild grin was a man determined to never feel powerless again. He wanted to be undeniable, the kind of presence you couldn't ignore even if you tried. That hunger didn't just guide him, it consumed him. And that intensity was exactly what pulled him into a new circle of musicians. A young, ferocious band with a sound as sharp as lightning and as loud as a jet engine. The moment Bon collided with AC/DC, two storms met at the same time. But what happened during that first encounter wasn't just fate. It was something far stranger, and it would set the stage for one of rock's most legendary partnerships. And strangely enough, the spark that connected them wasn't music at all. It started with something nobody expected. To the outside world, Bon Scott looked like a man built from pure adrenaline. Every show felt like he was daring the universe to try and stop him. Sweat flying, chest bare, eyes burning with that dangerous mix of charm and madness. It was the kind of presence that made entire crowds forget how to breathe. People assumed that wildness was who he was all the time. 24 hours of chaos, a walking explosion. But according to the people closest to him, especially Angus Young, that image was only half the truth. Backstage, when the amps cooled and the cheering dissolved, Bon turned into someone almost unrecognizable. He'd slip away from the noise and find a small corner, sometimes a hallway, sometimes a broom closet, sometimes just a dark spot behind the gear, anywhere he could be alone for a few minutes. There, he carried out a ritual he rarely talked about. He warmed up his voice in low, controlled tones, nothing like the firestorm he unleashed on stage. Quiet hums, sharp breaths, long, smooth notes. The older the band got, the more Angus noticed this pattern. The crazier the crowd was outside, the calmer Bon became inside. As if the stage needed the chaos, but the man needed the silence. And then there were the notebooks. Small, beat-up journals he kept shoved into jacket pockets or crammed into his bags. Not diaries, more like fragments. Half-written verses, angry confessions. Scribbles about moments that bothered him. Bandmates said they never saw him write in them, only closed them quickly whenever someone walked by. One of the crew claimed think Bon once said, "This is the only place I tell the truth." Maybe he was joking. Maybe he wasn't. People expected Bon to stumble into shows half drunk, laughing, barely standing. They didn't expect a man running through vocal discipline like a boxer prepping for the final round. And here's the twist. Despite the legend, Bon almost never drank before performing. He saved the chaos for after, when the show was finished and the mask could go back on. This version of Bon, the quiet one, the focused one, the one sharpening his voice like a blade, almost no one knew about him. For years, the band didn't talk about it, not publicly, but Angus would eventually reveal pieces of this secret side, the side that made Bon more human, more complicated, and somehow more tragic. And that hidden inner world played a huge role in what happened next, because joining AC/DC wasn't just a new chapter for Bon Scott. It was the beginning of a collision with two brothers who ran the band like a battlefield, and Bon walked straight into the line of fire. When Bon stepped into AC/DC, he wasn't just joining a band, he was stepping into a family empire, ruled by two brothers who operated on pure electricity and absolute discipline. Malcolm Young was the engine, Angus Young was the spark. Together, they built AC/DC like a machine designed to outlive everything around it. And Bon, he was the fire they strapped to the front. From day one, the chemistry was undeniable. Bon's voice wrapped around Malcolm's riffs like it had been waiting for that sound its whole life. Angus, barely out of his teens but already playing like a man possessed, felt an instant connection to the older, louder, wilder Scott. But that connection came with tension, and the tension came fast. The young brothers had a vision, tight, focused, no nonsense. Bon had instincts, chaotic, emotional, dangerous. The collision was inevitable. There's a story that floats around crew members, the kind of story you'd miss if you blinked. One night during early rehearsals, Bon tried to stretch a melody, throwing in a bluesy flourish that wasn't in the original arrangement. The band paused, waiting for Malcolm's reaction, and Malcolm, calm as a stone, said, "Do it again, and I'll cut the mic." It wasn't aggression. It wasn't ego. It was Malcolm's way of saying, "This band has a path, stay on it." Bon didn't argue, not out loud at least, but later that night, he filled an entire notebook page with a single sentence, repeated over and over, "Find the balance." And that became the foundation of their relationship. A tug of war between discipline and instinct. Malcolm was the order. Bon was the chaos. Angus floated somewhere in the middle, watching the two forces crash and fuse into something louder than either could make alone. But the tension wasn't always creative. There was a night in Sydney, the one the band almost never talks about, where a single argument nearly tore everything apart. It started with a joke. Bon teased Angus about the schoolboy outfit, saying, "One day they're gonna mistake you for an actual kid." Angus laughed, until Bon pushed it too far, tapping at a nerve no one knew existed. The room shifted. Malcolm stepped in, and the argument that followed didn't sound like banter. It sounded like a band standing on a fault line. No fists, no screaming, just 4 words from Malcolm, cold and final. "Sort it out now." The room fell silent. Bon backed off. Angus cooled down, and the moment passed, but it left a crack in the foundation. Small enough to hide, big enough to matter. Still, when the band walked on stage that night, none of it showed. The chaos became electricity, the tension became power, and the performance that followed was so explosive that fans still talk about it decades later. But tension has a way of building quietly, like pressure inside an engine. And while the band was climbing toward global success, Bon Scott was heading toward a night that would change everything. A night filled with mystery, contradictions, and questions that still don't have clear answers. Because every legend has a breaking point, and Bon's was closer than anyone realized. By 1980, Bon Scott looked unstoppable. Stadiums shook when he walked on stage. Fans clung to his voice like it was some kind of cosmic signal. A C/DC was days away from breaking through to a level no one in the industry had predicted. But behind the scenes, Bon was wearing thin. Friends noticed it first, the way he'd drift mid-conversation, zoning out for a second like he was sinking into his own thoughts. Crew members later said he had quiet spells, those rare moments where his laughter disappeared and something heavy replaced it. He'd scribble faster in his notebooks, then slam them shut the moment anyone got close. Still, no one expected what happened next. February 19th, 1980. A cold London night that felt like nothing more than another blur in a rock star's schedule. Bon met up with friends. They talked, they joked, they drank. But the people who were with him that night all tell slightly different versions of the story. Not about what he did, but about how he seemed. Some said he looked exhausted. Others said he was wired, unusually energetic. One friend said he was talking about taking a new direction with his music. Another said he barely spoke. The contradictions never stopped. Later, Bon was left in a car to sleep it off, something that, according to people close to him, wasn't unusual at the time. But this time, he didn't wake up. The official report called it death by misadventure, a cold phrase that barely fits a life as loud as his. But here's where the story stops being clean. and starts becoming a maze. Because from the moment news of his death broke, the narrative bent and twisted, timelines shifted. Statements didn't match. People close to him admitted they weren't sure where he had been during certain hours of the night. Rumors swarmed, insisting there was more to the story than anyone dared to say out loud. Some claimed Bon had been working on new ideas that week, ideas no one could find after he passed. Others whispered that one of his notebooks from that period vanished, never accounted for. And a few crew members, years later, said there were signs he had been emotionally drained, almost overwhelmed, days before the incident. But none of these fragments were enough to build a clear picture. Everything about that night lives in a fog, and maybe that's why speculation never died. Most fans accepted the official version. Others spent years questioning it. And the band, they stayed almost completely silent until much later. But silence doesn't erase a shadow, and Bon's shadow was enormous, large enough that the world wondered if AC/DC could even survive without him. What happened next didn't just surprise people, it reshaped the legacy of the band and revealed something about Bon that no one expected, especially when Angus Young decided to break his own silence. After Bon's death, grief didn't stay quiet for long. People wanted answers, and when answers felt incomplete, the questions multiplied. Some fans believed Bon had been writing intensely in the weeks before, ideas that hinted he wanted to take his music somewhere deeper. When a few of his notebooks couldn't be accounted for, the rumor mill exploded. Maybe he'd been planning something new. Maybe he'd written lyrics no one ever saw. No one knows for sure. The mystery stayed open. Others pointed to exhaustion. Friends admitted Bon had moments where the usual spark dimmed, quick flashes of silence, hints of pressure he didn't talk about. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make people wonder if he'd been carrying more weight than anyone realized. And then came the wilder theories, inconsistencies about who he was with that night, different versions of his final hours, little gaps in the timeline that became oversized in fans' imaginations. Most of it was speculation, emotional math people use when the truth feels too ordinary for a man as explosive as Bon Scott. But one thing kept resurfacing. Bon had a private world that no one fully understood. And years later, Angus Young would finally open the door to that hidden side. What he revealed didn't confirm any rumor. It did something bigger. It changed the way fans remembered Bon forever. For years, the Young brothers stayed silent about Bon's private life. They guarded his memory, avoided speculation, and never fed the rumors. That's why, when Angus finally spoke openly about Bon, the world paid attention. According to Angus, Bon lived with two sides: the wild frontman everyone saw, and a quieter man almost no one met. He revealed that Bon wrote constantly, not just lyrics, but thoughts, doubts, pieces of himself he never said out loud. After Bon's death, Angus found fragments of those writings, short lines, unfinished ideas, moments of honesty that didn't match the swagger on stage. Some were playful, some were sharp, but a few carried a weight that surprised even Angus. He said that if fans had seen this hidden side, they'd understand Bon differently, not as a reckless icon, but as someone who felt deeply and kept most of it locked inside. And then Angus admitted something that hit everyone hard. He never realized how much Bon held in until he was gone. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a dark secret. It was something far more human. And once Angus shared it, the world knew the band could never be the same, even if what came next would become the biggest turning point in AC/DC's history. When Bon Scott died, AC/DC didn't just lose a frontman. They lost the pulse of the band, the laughter in the studio, the chaos that fueled the fire. Even the Young brothers, famous for being unshakable, admitted they didn't know if the band could go on. But grief has a strange way of creating clarity. Just weeks later, they made a decision that seemed impossible from the outside: keep the band alive, not as a replacement for Bon, but as a tribute to him, a way to carry the engine he built into the future. They brought in Brian Johnson, someone Bon had admired long before AC/DC ever considered him. And almost immediately, the band did something no one expected. They poured every ounce of emotion, pain, and unfinished energy into a new album, Back in Black, a record soaked in Bon's spirit, a record built in the shadow of loss, a record that sounded like thunder refusing to die. It became one of the best-selling albums in the history of music, not despite Bon's absence, but partly because of it. Fans could feel that ghost in every note, every riff, every scream. It was AC/DC's way of saying, he's gone, but he's here, he always will be. And that's Bon Scott's legacy. Not a tragedy, not a mystery, not the rumors or theories, but a life that burned so intensely it left a permanent mark on rock itself. He didn't just sing the songs, he was the storm behind them. And even today, decades later, one question still lingers quietly in the minds of fans, musicians, and anyone who's ever turned up an AC/DC track a little too loud. If Bon Scott had lived, what kind of fire would he have unleashed next? No one will ever know, but maybe that's what makes his story unforgettable.